Hi, I'm Gary Katz, and welcome to the on-site educational home building series. I've been a finished carpenter for almost 30 years, and I've been writing about my craft for about half that long. And if I've learned anything about carpentry, it's that there's a lot to learn about carpentry. Today, most schools don't even teach manual arts classes, so it's even harder for carpenters to learn about their craft. And that's the purpose of this program, beginning with mastering the power miter saw. For the last few years, I've been teaching demonstrations and workshops around the country, and I've noticed one thing. A lot of people need to improve their skills, not just apprentices. I know I always need to improve mine. And I bet a lot of other experienced hands will profit from some of the techniques I'll be showing you in these programs, especially if they use some of the techniques to instruct their apprentices. Well, let's get to work then. Oh, before we get to work, take a look around this job site. It might look like a living room some of you have worked in with a tray ceiling, and some of the walls are kind of real, and they're drywall, but others are plywood, 1/4 inch. And there's no firebox in this mantelpiece. And the doors here, they're hollow core. And I store a lot of my material right behind it. And take a peek behind this curtain, like the Wizard of Oz. You get a look inside of my shop. That's my table saw over there. In a future program, we'll be using that. But over here, you'll notice that this door is sometimes here, and sometimes it's not. And these walls, sometimes they're beige, sometimes they'll be white. But this light that's coming through the window, it's going to always be coming through in exactly the same angle no matter what time of day it is. Because this is a workshop. It's a classroom. And we're here for education. Starting with the power miter saw. Probably the single most important tool that a finished carpenter uses. This is a sliding compound miter saw. And we'll get to this in a little while. First, let's take a look at its predecessor. This is a standard miter saw. It cuts in a chopping motion straight down through the material. And you can cut miters to the left just over 50 degrees, and you can swing to cut a miter to the right just over 50 degrees too. Now this is a compound miter saw because you can tip the saw to cut a bevel and slide the fence out of the way so that you can cut a bevel at any miter. And a bevel is when you're cutting the material in this direction, whereas a miter is when you're cutting the material in this direction. With a compound miter saw, you can cut a miter and a bevel simultaneously. Miter saws like this one, well, at least standard miter saws, have been around since the early 1960s, when moldings were pretty small. And that's one of the reasons that compound miter saws are becoming more popular these days, because moldings are becoming much bigger. This saw is very useful for cutting moldings in position, because you can cut baseboard and crown molding just over 5 inches tall with a saw like this, which is really handy. That means you can cut baseboard in position and crown molding, pretty large moldings. But if you have molding that's even bigger than that, you need a sliding compound miter saw. Let's take a look at that right now. This is a sliding compound miter saw. It'll cut standard miters just over 50 degrees to the left and up to 60 degrees to the right. Since it's a sliding compound miter saw, it also bevels to the left and to the right, which is very handy when you're cutting crown molding in position. Cutting with this saw is a little different, though, than cutting with a standard miter saw, because you don't cut in a chopping action with a sliding compound miter saw. You slide the saw out, then you lower it into the material and cut in reverse. That way you'll get a nice clean cut. If you cut pulling the saw toward you, the saw blade, because of the rotation of the blade, will tend to climb through the material. It's a little bit unsafe, but it's also really rough on the work. So the finest cut you're going to get is by cutting in this direction. Now this saw is different than any other saw on the market because the bevel lock is right here at the front of the saw. It's positioned right where you need it. So you can release the motor and turn it to a bevel and then lock it back down without having to reach behind the saw. In addition to that, there's an automatic detent to the right of the saw here. You can turn the detent so that you can free the saw to cut a bevel to the right. When you put the saw back past a 90, you heard that, the detent automatically snaps back into place so the saw will stop at 90 degrees. Now notice the bevel gauge. This saw also has one of the largest bevel gauges on any saw I've seen on the market. You can see the angle marks even from a distance, which enables you to dial the saw in precisely for a bevel cut. This saw is also unusual because it's the first one that has a trigger that's operated with your fingertips with safety switches on both the left side and the right side. So you can operate this saw with your right hand or with your left hand, which will eliminate a lot of dangerous moves that you might be tempted to make otherwise. In addition to that, you can operate this saw with the handle in a vertical position or with the handle at a 45-degree position. This is a 12-inch sliding compound miter saw, so it'll cut slightly larger material than a 10-inch. In addition to that, it'll cut larger material than most saws because it's belt-driven. Notice that the motor is mounted on the back of the saw, and all that runs to the arbor is the belt that's inside of this housing. That's a big advantage. I'll show you why. With the saw locked down, I can show you that this saw will cut up to 5 1/4-inch baseboard and crown molding in position against the fence. Anything bigger than that, and you have to tip the saw to a bevel and cut it a compound miter. But before we get to compound miters, let's cover the basics. And there's nothing more basic to a miter saw than a miter saw stand. Having the right tool setup is just as important as having the right tool, especially when it comes to power miter saws. A power miter saw can't be set up on the ground. It's not safe to cut with a saw like this on the ground, and you'll never do very accurate work with a setup like that. And that means more than just having a platform to set your saw on. You have to have continuous support for your workpiece. Continuous extension wings are the only way to ensure enough support to cut with a saw accurately and efficiently. Now, I've seen a lot of stands that have rollers or standards that you slide back and forth, and they may seem really handy, and some of those stands are inexpensive and they're lightweight, but they aren't nearly as useful as a continuous extension wing. Let me show you some of the reasons why. First, I use my continuous extension wings to ensure that all my cuts are precise and accurate. Instead of burning an inch when I'm cutting to a short point measurement, I line the short point up so that it's flush with the edge of my extension wing, and I hook a tape measure right on the end of the wing to pull a measurement. Not only that, I can hook my tape measure on this end of the saw, right on the end of the extension wing, and pull a measurement clear down here with guaranteed precision to within a 32nd of an inch. Now, try doing that with a stand with rollers. Now, that's not all this stand will do either. Check this out. I don't even have to pull a tape measure out. I flush the short point up with the edge of the extension wing, and I just scoot this piece of molding back a little bit, and look, there's a tape measure that's glued down to the front edge of the extension wing. So all I have to do is mark a measurement. Boy, that saves a lot of time. But let me show you something that saves even more time. Repetitive stops. Finished carpentry is all about repetitive work. You're cutting the same size pieces over and over again, and if you can't set your saw up with repetitive stops that'll flip out of your way so you can slide your piece past to cut a longer piece, or flip it back down again to cut the same size piece again, then you're wasting an awful lot of time pulling out a tape measure. Let me show you another flip stop that comes with this American Design and Engineering stand. It's a flip stop, and it's extremely accurate. You can dial it in for the size cut you want, And then you can adjust this stop as well so that you can cut a piece within a 64th of an inch repetitively over and over and over again and still flip it right out of your way so that you can slide a longer piece past it and use an additional flip stop or just make a special cut for a special measurement. But that's not all. I use my continuous extension wings, especially since they're durable and rock steady, as a portable workstation. When I'm coping crown molding or coping baseboard, or if I'm making a really delicate scribe cut in a piece of material, I like to take the piece of material and clamp it right to the extension wing. And that way, I have a really solid workstation to work at that's right next to my miter saw. So all of my cutting operations are done in the same location. Now, this American design and engineering stand is kind of like the Cadillac of miter saw stands. And it comes with just about every feature you could possibly need. But if you have peculiar needs, or if you just want to build your own stand, you can do that too. I built mine, and I used American design and engineering couplings, so I can attach it to my saw the same way the AD&E stand attaches. Let me show you how that works. An AD&E coupler has a big knob on the end of it, so you can loosen the knob and pull the extension wing right off. I use the same couplers on my wooden stand, so it attaches just as easily. And I used wooden legs for my stand, so I can adjust it up or down for any type of terrain. Make sure the stand is completely level. And I made my own fence and flip stops too. The fence is a sliding fence. See, it slides along this stop right over the top of this T-bolt. The T-bolt enters the track on the bottom of the fence, and that way I can lock the fence down in any position I want. Now the flip stops slide in the fence in exactly the same way. There's a T-bolt on the bottom. It slides inside of a T-shaped track that I cut with a router bit, so the little flip stops can be tightened down, flipped up out of the way, or flipped down for making repetitive cuts. Now the nice thing about this system is that you can loosen the fence and slide it out so that you can make repetitive cuts for door casings up to 8 feet long and still only have about a 5-foot extension wing stored in your truck. That's the reason I made my own stand. Before I cut any material, I want to say a few words about safety. Construction is a dangerous occupation, and you should take safety seriously, no matter which tool you're using. I give my apprentices a few tips before I allow them to start cutting on a saw, and I hope you'll follow those tips too. The first one is, when you use a power miter saw, always keep your hands locked behind the fence. That's the safest way to use the saw, and your hand will never have a tendency to wander toward the blade. Besides, that's the only way you can guarantee precise cuts. With your hand locked behind the edge of the back of the fence and your thumb wrapped around the front of the molding, you can control the material and slowly inch the material right up to the blade. Let me show you what I mean. You'll notice I waited for the saw blade to stop moving before I pulled it up out of the material. That's important for two reasons. First, for safety. If you wait for the blade to stop moving before you pull it out of the material, you'll never be tempted to move your hand underneath the blade while it's still moving. And second, if you wait for the blade to stop moving before you pull it out of the material, the teeth won't chatter along the miter and mess up a perfect cut. And another thing, and this is really important, Never attempt to cut a piece of molding that's shorter than 12 inches. Your fingers are worth a lot more than any piece of molding. And finally, if you do have to cut a piece of molding that won't reach to the end of the fence, then use a clamp. This clamp is provided with a saw and slips in quickly and easily. So easy that you should never be tempted to make a cut without it. That's all there is to it. You can still lift it up and adjust the piece incrementally. And if you don't have a clamp like this, and if it wasn't supplied with your saw, then carry a fast-acting clamp right near your saw base where it's easy to reach and you won't be tempted to make a cut without a clamp. There are several other safety concerns that I cover in a slideshow that accompanies this DVD, so be sure to watch that before you use this tool.
Always wear safety glasses. Safety glasses used to be clumsy. They scratched easily and they fogged up as soon as you put them on. But there's no longer any excuse for not wearing safety glasses. Today, safety glasses are available in a variety of styles. They're scratch-resistant, and some are even fog-free. The tinted goggles at the center top are fog-free, and they're available from Dust Be Gone. They're great for 100% protection. The wraparound glasses at the left and the right are available from most home centers, and you can find a distributor through Fast Cap, too. The glasses at the bottom are mine. They're prescription glasses made from high-impact polycarbonate, and they have protective side shields, too. Always wear hearing protection. I can't hear my daughter's telephone ring anymore, both because the pitch on her phone is the same as the tinnitus ringing in my ears, and because I've lost hearing in both my ears because of loud noise. If only I'd worn hearing protection when I started in this business. Without getting into decibels, I'll simply say that when it comes to hearing protection, something is better than nothing. Find the type of hearing protection that you're most comfortable with and wear it always. I like the earplugs with the neck cord on the bottom right. I always know where they are. The expanding foam plugs, bottom left, offer more protection, but I lose them too easily. And I've never been comfortable wearing either of the headsets at the top, though they're often the most effective. Always wear dust protection. Dust protection is like hearing protection, except instead of being measured in decibels, it's measured in microns. And with the type of material carpenters cut these days, and recent tests suggest that wood sawdust is carcinogenic, you should always wear a dust mask or a respirator, in addition to providing plenty of ventilation. The respirator on the bottom left offers the most protection. The disposable masks at the bottom right and top left offer only fair protection, though they're more comfortable and readily available from home centers. The surgical type mask at the top right is available from Dust Be Gone. It's comfortable to wear and can be washed repeatedly. Use a dust collector. Dust collectors are important too, especially for table saws, chop saws, and routers. On the job site, a shop vac is better than nothing. But in a shop, you can collect a lot more dust with a central system. Dust from a miter saw is the most difficult to control, and I'm still experimenting with this contraption. Miter saw safety. Never disable a saw guard. Saw guards are made for a purpose, believe me. I've seen the statistics. Too many serious accidents are caused by carpenters removing the guards. Don't remove the guard on your saw. There are safer, easier, and more accurate ways of lining up the blade with the measurement mark. Keep your hand behind the fence. I'm not a safety spokesman for the miter saw industry, and I'm not just repeating the instructions I've read that come with the tools. The reason I keep my hand at the back of the fence is so I can control the workpiece and creep the measurement mark slowly up to the blade. But the practice also saves my hand from a common miter saw injury. Remember, your hands and fingers are worth more than any piece of molding. Use clamps. Yes, I use clamps too, whenever the need arises, and that's why I always keep them hanging from my miter saw stand, so I won't hesitate to reach for a clamp whenever I'm about to make a dangerous cut. Remember, If you hear that little voice in the back of your head whispering a warning, stop and listen to it. Wait for the saw to stop before reaching past the blade. I'm a production carpenter and I break this rule far more than I should, but I try not to. Most miter saws are equipped with electric brakes these days, and it only takes a couple of seconds for the blade to stop. Sure, if your saw has a guard, what's the risk? Well, what if that guard hangs up just once?
Nobody ever taught me how to use a power miter saw. I really had to learn on my own. Sure, my first boss, he showed me how I could cut my hand off and get blood all over his brand new saw, but all he really did was take me out to a closet in the back of the job and said, base that. I spent hours in that closet trying to figure out which way the miters went. I had piles of little pieces on the floor. Let's not talk about that. That's just a terrible way to teach a new employee how to use one of these saws. I have a new method I use. Let me show you what it is. Angles don't come easy to me. They don't come easy to most carpenters. Most of us, when we learn this business, we learn how to visualize corners. We imagine that this piece has to be cut at an angle like this in order to meet up and mate with a piece that's cut at an angle like this. This would be for an outside corner. Visualization, though, can get very confusing. It's tough with casing, but when you cut crown molding, you can really get confused. First, you have to think about whether it's an inside corner, like this, or an outside corner, like that. Then you have to start to visualize whether the miter goes this way, or whether it goes this way, and whether the bevel goes this way, or whether it goes this way, so that the joints will line up perfectly. That's an awful lot to visualize. What a lot of carpenters end up doing is they stand like this, in case you've ever seen one standing at a saw with his eyes closed and a pencil in his mouth. They're visualizing what the corner in a room 30 or 40 feet away looks like so that they can cut their crown molding at the right miter and the right bevel. That's a really tough way to run a miter saw. Instead of the visualization method, I've been teaching my apprentices a new method for mastering a power miter saw, and it's all dependent on long points and short points. Let me show you what I mean with this piece of casing. This acute angle is called the long point of the miter. This obtuse angle is called the short point of the miter. That's what casing's all about. Let's look at this door. With some moldings, like baseboard and crown molding, you have to be concerned about short points and long points, inside corners, outside corners. But with casing, all you have to worry about are short points, because casing always wraps around an opening, just like this door jamb, or the casing around this window jamb. It's picture framed. Notice the miters all run from the long point to the short point. And the molding wraps around the opening like a picture frame so that the short points are always against the jamb and the long points are always away from the jamb. That's the beauty and the simplicity of casing. It makes it really easy to measure and cut. When you measure casing, all you're concerned about are short points. You measure the jamb from the inside of the jamb to the inside of the jamb. That measures 32 inches. And you add for the reveal. The reveal is the amount of jamb that's exposed after the casing is attached to it. I have to add for the reveal on both sides of the jamb, 1/4 of an inch on each side. So this piece of head casing is going to measure 32.5 inches from short point to short point. Now the leg casing, I measure from the inside of the jamb at the head to the floor, which is 82.5 inches to the head of the jamb. That's right here. And I add 1/4 of an inch for the reveal on the head jamb. That makes this leg 82 3/4 of an inch to the short point. Now that I have the measurement for the leg and the measurement for the head, I'm ready to cut some casing. When I cut casing, I like to cut the legs first because they're the longest pieces usually. That way I can cut the heads last out of the short pieces that are left over. Let me show you a little trick here that I do all the time. A lot of people get confused when they're cutting the casing legs because one piece gets mitered this way, the other piece gets cut that way, and you start to lose track of how many left sides you cut and how many pieces for the right side you cut. The best way of handling casing legs is to put one piece to the left of the saw and one piece to the right of the saw. And that way, the piece on the right is the right-hand piece and the piece on the left is the left-hand piece. When you cut the piece on the left, you just have to swing your saw to the left. And you're cutting a perfect miter for a left-hand piece. And for the right, just swing your saw to the right, and you're cutting a miter perfectly for a right-hand piece. When I measure casing, we wanted this piece to be 82 3/4. First, notice that the casing's sitting flat on the saw like this, the way it's going to sit on the wall. Casing always sits flat, right on the base of the saw. And the other thing to remember about casing is you always want the short point, where I made this measurement mark, toward you, not against the fence. If the short point is toward you, you can guide the saw blade right into the mark. If the short point is up against the fence, then you can't see it when you guide the saw blade into the material. This way, you can take the saw blade and bring it right to the mark, precisely every single time. Now, another technique that's equally important is called the creep. I use the creep to make sure that I cut precisely to my measurement line. I keep my right hand, in this case, I'm cutting the right piece of casing, I keep my right hand locked on the molding right behind the fence with my finger right there on the fence. It not only protects my hand from getting too close to the blade, but it also allows me to control the piece of material precisely so I can creep the molding and the measurement mark right up to the moving blade. Watch this. See, I was able to take that material right up to the blade and cut right on the measurement line. That finishes off the right-hand piece. Now all I have to do is cut the left-hand piece exactly the same way. Then I could hand this job off to an apprentice, especially if I set up my repetitive stops. If you recall from the beginning of the program, I use repetitive stops as frequently as I can because it's a lot faster and more accurate than pulling out a tape measure. Especially when you're cutting casing, you can take a repetitive stop and mount it to your saw fence and cut one piece after another exactly the same length. And it's a perfect job for an apprentice. But we're not done yet. The hardest part's still left to be done. Once the legs are cut, we've got to cut the heads, because we cut those out of the shorter pieces. Now the heads are tougher because they're mitered on both ends. The problem with cutting a piece of casing that has a miter on both ends, like the head casing, is that you can't hook the tape measure on the short point anyplace. So a lot of people will burn an inch. They'll take their tape measure and stretch it out and then line up the 1-inch mark with the miter like so. And then they'll come across over to here and make their measurement mark, just like so. Not only that, but if you have a really long piece and you don't have continuous extension wings like this, if you have a saw that doesn't have a stand, or if you have a saw that has roller stands, you don't have a choice because there's no place to work where you can stretch a tape measure out like that. You have to take the piece and put it down on the floor. And a lot of people that I see working on jobs do it just like this. And they line that 1-inch mark up. And if it's a really long piece, they'll have to walk clear across the room, maybe once or twice to get this just perfect. Because the tape gets, pushed away from the casing. You have to move the casing up closer to the tape. Then you have to check and make sure that that 1-inch mark is still flush. And then get your measurement mark on there, just like so. Now the problem with that method is that 9 times out of 10, when you go to cut the piece, it ends up being exactly 1 inch short because you forget to add that inch back in that you burned at this end, just like I did. That's why I don't measure my casing that way anymore at all, and I don't let any of the guys on my crew measure that way. Instead, I flush the short point up with the end of my continuous extension wing and then just hook my tape measure right on the continuous extension wing and pull my measurement mark, and I'm not 1 inch short. Now I'll cut this piece. First I'll get this one out of the way. There, that finishes the head, almost. Before I move it, I'm going to set up a repetitive stop right on the end of that miter, right there. I want to check it, make sure it's exactly in the right place. Right there is perfect. Now I can hand this job off to an apprentice, and they can cut all the rest of this casing. But there's one more thing about casing. Sometimes, no matter how carefully you cut the miter, the molding doesn't close up tightly on the wall. Let's take a look at this door again. If the miter at the short point is open, or if the miter at the top near the long point is open, it can be because the wall is proud of the jamb, or the jamb is proud of the wall. That'll force the miter open at one end or the other. There's a really easy way to fix that, though. All you have to do is back bevel the miter a little bit while the piece is at the saw. Let's do that right now. So to fix that problem, I tip the casing up off the base of the saw. Not a lot, just a little bit. So when I pass the blade through the miter, it'll shave the miter and back cut it at a slight bevel. That means I'll be taking a little bit off the bottom or back of the casing, but nothing off the top, because I don't want to change this short point here. I don't want to make this piece of casing any shorter than it is. So this is how I do it. Watch. I'm going to tip this piece up to back cut it a tiny bit. Now I'm going to slide the casing up to the blade just to make sure I'm not going to take any off the front edge. Now I've just shaved a little bit off the back of that miter, and these two pieces will close up very tightly. We'll get a good miter. Now, you don't have to use a miter saw to do that. You can also use a little sanding block like this and just sand the back edge of that miter off a little bit. But I'll cover that in a later program on installing casing. That about covers it for casing. Now remember, trim carpentry is all about long points and short points. Casing is only about short points. Your measurement marks are always made at the short point of the material, and you always want the short point toward you when you place the casing down in the miter saw. That means that the long point will always be up against the fence.
Casing is installed around door and window openings, just like molding around a picture frame. Headpieces always have miters on both ends. Sometimes legs on windows do too, but legs on doors are mitered only at the top. They're cut square at the bottom. When you measure casing, you measure the ID of the jamb and add for the reveal. When you cut casing, the long point is always against the fence. The measurement mark is always on the short point, and the short point is always away from the fence, toward you, so you can see the measurement mark clearly and creep the measurement mark right up to the blade.
Baseboard forms the perfect foundation for all of joinery throughout finished carpentry, and it's the perfect place to start your apprentices. But before you send one of your apprentices off to that dark corner for the first time, give them a little history lesson. let him know that this molding dates back thousands of years to the Greek and Roman temples. Baseboard mimics the plinth or bottom of a classical column. We borrowed that detail to trim off our mantelpieces, bookshelves, cabinets, and the walls in our homes. Baseboard frames the rectangles in which we live, and those rectangles often have rectangles within them. Like the pilaster on this mantelpiece here. But the most common joint occurs on an inside corner, like this one right here, where two walls meet. And over here is another inside corner. And right here is an outside corner, on a very outside corner of the mantelpiece where it turns and runs in this direction. Usually when you have an outside corner like this on a column, you have a pair. So you have two right here. And on the other side of this, we've got a butt joint, right where the pilaster meets the wall in here. Now, of course, there'd be a firebox here, so we have to imagine that there's a firebox here, and this butt joint just is cut flush, so it terminates right up against the firebox. One other termination that also occurs is this self-return. They don't occur as often, but this termination happens whenever a stairway falls off, or a landing, or a wall suddenly ends. Because there's so many different corners and joints in baseboard, I always make a cut list. And when I make a cut list, I face the wall just like I am now, so that the right-hand joint is on my right-hand side and the left-hand joint is on my left. And when I move around the room, I always move to my left. And that's because I'm right-handed, and it's easier for a right-handed person to cope the right-hand end of a piece of molding than it is to cope the left-hand end. But I'll get to that later. I don't want to talk about coping right now. I'll do that in a later program. This is a program on mastering the miter saw, and I want to demonstrate how to make better miters. There's two things I'd like to show you. How to easily identify inside corner and outside corner miters, and how to measure more accurately. I just tacked all these pieces here. I haven't gotten these miters up as tight as they need to be if it was finished work, but this is for a demonstration. Let me pull this piece off here. There we go. Yeah, you notice that I've pre-assembled these corners. I do that a lot with baseboard when I'm running it around a small pilaster or something like that. I'll show you that in a later program too. But what I really want to show you here are the miters, how much easier it can be to identify inside and outside corner miters. Notice that the miter on this inside corner is right up against the wall here. The long point is touching the inside corner of the wall on the pilaster, just like the long point on this corner over here. Whereas the outside corner is different. The short point of the miter is up against the pilaster. That's the same way it would be if this were an outside corner of two walls meeting. The short point on an outside corner is always up against the wall. Remember that. I'll be talking about long points and short points throughout this program. Now let's talk about measuring. I've been bending a tape measure like this into corners for over 25 years, and I've learned how to interpret a measurement like that. But that's what it takes to read a bent tape measure, interpretation. But there's an easier way to teach a beginner or an apprentice. I know many carpenters that have been using this method because it improves accuracy. They take a block of wood like this, something about as tall as the baseboard, and they cut a miter on one end of it, and the other end square cut, and they make it exactly either 3 inches or 4 inches. I've made this one 4 inches, but it all depends on which number is easiest for you to add to other numbers. Let me show you what I mean. First, I'm going to remove all of these pieces. You can see they're just tacked in here with brads. Instead of trying to bend my tape measure into this corner, I'm going to take this piece of wood here and set it right up against the inside corner and measure to it. That's 18 and 5/8 would be a nice tight piece. That means I have to add 4 inches to that measurement, which is going to make it that 22 and 5/8 measurement that I got by bending my tape measure into the corner. So I can either measure to the end of this block like that, or I can just put a pencil line on the back of that piece and get 18 and 5/8 that way. So all I have to remember is to add the 4 inches to the 18 and 5/8 so I get the right measurement. Otherwise, the piece is going to end up being 4 inches too short. So that means it's got to be 22 and 5/8. So I'll write that down right in the middle of my cut list here. Now I'll put a check mark just like that on the left side, and another one on the right side too. I use a check mark to note inside corners, and this piece has an inside corner on the left and the right. Now this second piece, let me measure that, measures 4 inches, so I'll write that down. And it has an inside corner on the right, so I'll put a check mark there, and an outside corner on the left, so I'll write OC right there. That's for outside corner. And the third piece measures 6.5 inches, and that's from outside corner to outside corner. So I'll write 6.5 inches on my cut list. And it has an outside corner on the right and an outside corner on the left. Now the last piece, I'm going to reposition myself here, measures 4 inches from a butt cut to an outside corner. So I'm going to write 4 inches right in the center of the piece of wood, and I'll put an outside corner on the right-hand side and a butt cut on the left-hand side. This last piece over here is different. Remember, this is a self-return, and it's kind of arbitrary how long this is. This is the kind of joint that you'd have to cut if a landing or a stairway was falling away right there. If the stair or nosing on the stair were right to about here on the floor, I'd want to stop the self-return back where the bullnose on the tread or on the landing begins. So this piece then would measure about 18.5 inches, not to the short point where an outside corner would be measured to, but to the very longest point, and that's about 18.5 inches. So I'll write 18.5 right in the middle of this piece. Now the left corner is a regular inside corner, so I'll just use a check mark there. But the right corner is a self-return. It looks like an outside corner, but it's different. I'll write SR here. Now let's go over to the saw and I'll show you how to cut these pieces.
Cutting baseboard is more complicated than cutting casing, but to make it easier, I always pretend that the fence is the wall. You can see I've added this accessory fence to my saw because it provides a more stable surface in which I can cut this baseboard in front of, and also it reminds me that this flat surface is the wall. The back of the baseboard goes against the wall, and the face of the baseboard faces me, just like it does on the wall. And that way, when I use a cut list, the right-hand corner is the right-hand end of the base, and the left-hand corner is the left-hand end of the base. All that's left is to figure out which way to swing the miter. That can get a little confusing too. What I do, instead of trying to visualize what each corner looks like, is I remember that for an inside corner, the long point is always against the fence, and for an outside corner, the short point is against the fence. Let's start cutting this list, and I'll show you what I mean. Now this first piece has an inside corner on both sides, and I like to cut inside corners first, especially left-hand inside corners. Here's why. Now, that is an inside corner. Notice how the long point is against the fence. I got to cut another inside corner on the opposite side, but first I want to make my measurement. Now I can hook my tape measure on the long point, which is why I like to measure inside corners first, and I like to measure left-hand inside corners first because my tape measure is right side up. That's 22 5/8. Now I'm going to swing the saw and cut a miter for that corner. Once again, it's an inside corner, so the long point will be against the fence. I'm going to line a tooth up from the blade right with that mark and
cut right on the measurement line. See how easy it is to cut baseboard when the measurement mark is right on the top? All you have to do is guide the blade right to the measurement mark, and you can cut precisely every time. That finishes the first cut. Now some of you might be wondering why I haven't coped this piece. I'll be covering coping in a later program. Right now, I want to concentrate on mastering the power miter saw. The second piece has an outside corner on the left and an inside corner on the right. And remember, I like to cut those inside corners first. That way, I can hook my tape. Yep, I laid it down this time so I can get my tape measure on it and measure this pretty short piece at 4 inches. I don't even have to swing the saw because I'm going to cut an outside corner on this piece. But notice first, I've got my left hand hooked over the edge of the accessory fence. It serves 2 purposes. It keeps my hand away from the blade, and it also gives me a point of leverage so I can creep this blade, I can creep the material right up to the blade. Now I waited for the blade to stop before I took it out of the material. Otherwise, since I wasn't holding this piece, it might have fallen into the teeth and ruined this edge. So that finishes piece number 2. Now let's cut the third piece. It has an outside corner on both ends. So the first thing I want to do is cut an outside corner on this piece because it's got an inside corner. See, the long point is against the fence. So I want to swing the saw and cut an outside corner. Now the short point is against the fence. I'm going to slide the piece over to the edge of the accessory fence so that the short point is flush with the fence. That way I can hook my tape measure on the fence to pull my measurement. Now this is for another outside corner on the left side. So I'm going to swing the saw over to this side and cut this corner. And that finishes the third piece. Now let's cut the fourth piece. It has an outside corner on the right end and a butt cut on the left end. Now I could cut an outside corner on this piece and then flush the short point up with the edge of my accessory fence, just like I did the last one, but it's a lot easier to pull a measurement from a butt cut. So instead, I'm going to swing the saw to a 90 and cut a butt cut on this end. Now all I have to do is swing the saw for that outside corner, and remember, for an outside corner, the short point is against the fence. Now that finishes the fourth piece, so there's just one left to cut. This last piece has a self-return on the right and an inside corner on the left. Now I know I usually like to cut the inside corners first so I can hook my tape measure on them, but for this piece I want to cut the self-return first, and I'll show you why. A typical outside corner has a measurement mark right at the top of it where the short point occurs. But for a self-return, the measurement mark is on the long point right at the face of the material, and it's difficult to guide the saw blade into there. So instead, I cut this corner first so I can measure from it rather than to it. So I have to cut a self-return on this end. And I'll measure from that long point 18.5 inches. Notice I measured right at the bottom of the baseboard. Now I'm going to slide the base over to the edge of the saw, at the very outside of the saw base down here. And because my accessory fence is flush with that point, I can use the accessory fence to transfer the mark up to the top of the molding, instead of having to pull out a square. Now I want to cut an inside corner on this piece. That means the long point's got to be against the fence. And the miter of the saw is already swung in the right direction. There, that finishes the last piece. Not quite. Remember, this is a self-return. I still have to cut that little piece that caps this end and returns to the wall. To get that, I can cut it out of this piece. I just have to know which end. Now, this is the direction that this piece runs in, and the self-return has to make a 90-degree turn and go to the wall. So I can cut it right off this end of the piece. All I have to do is swing the saw to the opposite miter. That's the outside corner of the self-return. Now all I have to do is trim that little piece off. To do that, I'm going to line the blade up with the short point of the cut and inch the piece up right to the blade. Now that little piece is going to finish off this corner there and self-return the base right to the wall. And that finishes off baseboard.
When it comes to baseboard, there are only two primary joints, inside corners and outside corners. For an inside corner, on the left, the long point of the miter is against the wall. For an outside corner, on the right, the short point of the miter is against the wall. The piece I need is on the left side of the blade. When you cut an inside corner, the long point is always against the fence, just like it is on the wall. That's the far left side of this piece. When you cut an outside corner, which is the cut I'm finishing here, the short point is always against the fence, the same way it is on the wall.
People say that cutting crown molding is one of the most difficult jobs for a finished carpenter. Phooey. Cutting crown molding is just as easy as cutting baseboard. In fact, it's a lot easier. You don't have to get down on your knees. There's two ways to cut crown molding. One is in position against the saw like so, and the other is on the flat. I'm going to talk about how to cut crown molding in position because it's the easiest way to cut. It's the most efficient way and the most productive way to cut crown molding. In position means that the crown molding is exactly in the same position on the saw as it will be against the ceiling, except the molding is upside down. Notice that the bottom of the molding, which has this profile on it, is up rather than down. The bottom of the molding is also where the measurement mark occurs, so it's kind of handy to have it upside down because you'll be able to see the saw blade and the measurement mark at the same time. In order to cut in position, it's really important that the flat on the back of the crown molding is flat against the fence, and the flat on the top of the crown molding is flat against the base. Once I have the molding positioned exactly the way it's going to be on the ceiling, I draw a pencil line right across the top of the crown molding. It's actually the bottom of the crown molding, along the back of the fence. That pencil line helps to ensure that the crown molding will always be in the same position every time I cut. If it's not in the same position, then the bevels are going to change each time I cut a miter, and then my joints won't fit. Even with a pencil line, it's difficult to hold the crown molding in that position perfectly every time. So I use a crown stop. AD&E has an accessory stop that's available for this saw stand that I'm using here. I've made this continuous board that I've attached to these accessory stops that makes it even easier. You can take this sliding board now and adjust it until the crown is perfectly in position against the saw, and then tighten down the lugs at each end, and the crown molding won't move at all. With a continuous stop like this, even long pieces of crown are easy to hold in position, which makes them easier to measure as well. When I'm using my wooden extension wings, I just use a piece of scrap wood and clamp or screw that directly to the extension wings and use that as a continuous stop. Now there's several different corners that have to be cut for crown molding, and I've built a model over here on the wall to make it easier to show you what I mean. Here we have an inside corner to an inside corner, and on this side an inside corner to an outside corner. These are two of the most standard pieces that you cut with crown molding. It's the outside corners that carpenters like the most because they bring the drama out of the crown molding. And this piece here is an example of an outside corner to an outside corner, which is a common piece that you have like around a kitchen wall or a column. And at this end, I've demonstrated a self-return. A self-return is a piece you often have where a soffit line ends or a ceiling ends at a soffit, and you have to terminate the crown. The best way to do that is to turn the corner and bring the crown directly back to the wall, which is why it's called a self-return. Now the next step is to make a cut list. I'm going to remove these pieces. I can show you that now I've already made a cut list for this area in here because that's how I cut all those pieces. But I want to go through it again just to show you how I did it. But before I can make a cut list, I need a gauge block. Making a gauge block is easy. Once you've traced the rise of the crown molding on the fence, you just measure to that line, it's 3 3/8, and cut a block exactly that size. I'm going to write save on there so I won't lose it. You see, with a gauge block, I can make a mark at the bottom of the crown molding on the wall, and it'll be exactly the same at every corner of the room. I don't like to use a tape measure because it's too easy to make measurement mistakes with a tape measure. Once I've marked all the corners with a gauge block, then I can snap lines from corner to corner. I use a chalk line and I make sure that I snap lines all the way around the room from every corner so that it'll give me a position, it'll give me the position that the crown molding goes in when I go to install it, and it also gives me a location to measure the length of the crown molding. So I measure pretty close to those locations of the lines. This one's 27 1/8. And this one's 17 1/4. And I write those measurements right above the lines, as you can see. This one here on the end is 20 inches. Now I'm ready to make a cut list. I make a cut list the same way I do for baseboard. I stand and face the wall and write the measurement down right in the center of the board. On the right side, I put the right corner. In this case, it's an inside corner, so I make a little check. And on the left side, I put the left corner. That's a check, too, for another inside corner. Now, this piece here is an inside corner to an outside corner. This one measures 17 1/4. and the right side is an inside corner, and the left side is an outside corner. Now this piece here is an outside corner to a self-return. I write down 20 inches, and on the right side it's an outside corner, and on the left side it's a self-return. Now I've got a cut list. I don't usually write more than 3 or 4 pieces onto a cut list because it's too easy to get confused with crown molding. Another thing that helps me from getting confused is making sure that I have the ends marked, all the joints and the corners marked on the cut list, so that when I go back to my chop saw, I don't have to visualize which way to cut those corners. This way, you don't get confused when you go back to the chop saw and you're cutting crown molding in position when it's upside down and backwards. Now that we've got a cut list, we're almost ready to start cutting the crown. First, I want to go over how to determine which angle or which miter to cut the crown at. When I first started out cutting crown molding, I was taught to make a couple of patterns, one with an outside corner on one end, one with an inside corner on the other, and exactly the same piece, but opposite cuts for each end. That way you can take 2 pieces and you can put them together at an outside corner. They also help you assemble and install the moldings when that time comes. And you can take the 2 pieces and put them together like so for an inside corner. You can also take the pieces, and this is the way most people generally use them. You can take the 2 pieces and set them down in your saw like this, just before you make any cut. They can tell that to do an outside corner on the end of this piece, they'll swing the saw in this direction. To do an outside corner on this piece, they'll swing the saw in the opposite direction. And the same for inside corners. For an inside corner on the end of this piece, you'd swing the saw in this direction, and for an inside corner on this piece, you'd swing the saw in this direction. The whole system is a little bit cumbersome, though, and there's a much simpler way of figuring it out. Notice that the inside corners on these 2 pieces have the long points against the fence. And the outside corners on these 2 pieces have the short points against the fence. And it's always that way. In, long. Out, short. It's kind of like Las Vegas. You go in long and you come out short. Now we know which way to swing the miter, but there's still a rub. The material is upside down. So the left-hand cut is the right-hand joint, and the right-hand cut is the left-hand joint. You can imagine how confusing that gets, but there's a way to keep it straight, and it's very simple. As soon as you install your crown stop, write right hand in the left-hand corner, and write left hand in the right-hand corner. That way, it's real easy to cut the pieces on your list. The right-hand joint is always cut off that end. The left-hand joint is always cut off this end. Now we're ready to cut some crown. I like to cut the inside corners first, and notice this first piece has 2 inside corners. And in that case, I like to cut the right-hand inside corners first. Remember, the right-hand inside corner has to be cut off this end of the material. So I'm going to cut an inside corner right there, in which case we want the long point to be against the fence. Now the reason I like to cut my right-hand inside corners first will become obvious in just a second. If I cut my right-hand inside corners first, I can hook my tape measure on the long point and read my tape measure right side up. So I'll make a fine line right there. And remember, I'm using a number 2.5 pencil, not a number 2. I'm getting a much sharper line with a 2.5 lead pencil. Now, I'm going to swing the miter in the opposite direction because I want the long point to be against the fence. with my left hand hooked behind the auxiliary fence, I'm able to take this blade and creep right up on that measurement mark. And that finishes piece number 1. Now piece number 2 has an outside corner on the left end and an inside corner on the right end. Oh look, this is an outside corner on the left. Oh no, that's not the left end. That's the right end. So the first thing I'm going to do is swing the saw to the opposite miter and cut an inside corner with the long point against the fence. And then slide that piece forward so I can hook my tape measure on the end and measure to 17 1/4. Now this is an outside corner. I want the short point against the fence, so I don't even have to swing the saw to a different miter. I just have to align that measurement mark. And I can do that by creeping this blade right up on the material again. Well, that finishes the second piece. Now I'm ready to cut the third piece. Now the third piece has a self-return on the left side and an outside corner on the right side. I like to cut my self-returns first because then I can hook over that outside long point. It's a lot easier to do that than to try and cut it from the opposite end. So the first thing I want is a self-return on the left side. Now the left side is over here. So I'm going to cut an outside corner on this end of the molding. Now, if this were an outside corner to an outside corner piece, I'd flush the short point up with the very end of my auxiliary fence. Then I can hook my tape measure on the auxiliary fence and make my measurement mark on the top of the crown molding, which is really the bottom. But this is a self-return, so I want to measure from the furthest extension of the long point. So I can hook my tape measure right on the long point. So I'll make a really nice mark here right at 20 inches. Fairly long one. I'll show you why. I have to transfer that mark up to the bottom of the crown molding so that I can make my cut. Remember, this mark's at the top of the crown molding. In order to do that, rather than pulling out another tool like a square, I'll just take this cut list here and use it as a guide to transfer a square mark from the fence across to my crown stop. That way, I can take this piece of crown molding and line that measurement at 20 inches up with the crown stop and use that to transfer a mark right across to the bottom of the crown molding at the edge of the fence. Now I'm ready to cut that outside corner. In order to do that, I have to swing the miter in the opposite direction because I want the short point to be against the fence for this outside corner. Once again, I've got my hand hooked around the crown molding so I can creep the blade right. Now that finishes the third piece. And we're almost done. All I have left to do is cut the small self-return that comes off the end of this piece and terminates against the wall. Now I didn't write that down on my cut list because it's such a simple piece. There's no measurement for it. I just needed to remember which end gets the outside corner cut, and that would be to continue this outside corner right to the wall. See, if this piece here has a self-return on the left-hand side, in other words, an outside corner on the left-hand side, that means the little self-return that goes back to the wall has to have an outside corner on the right-hand side. Now the left-hand side of that piece would just be a simple butt cut because it butts right into the wall. We don't need a measurement on it because the two cuts are very simple, but we do know that that outside corner is on the right-hand side. Now to cut the right-hand outside corner, I'm going to have to cut it off this end of the piece of stock. Let me slide this out of the way. That means I have to cut the outside corner right off this end. An outside corner means the short point has to be against the fence, which is just the way the saw is set up. Now I have one last cut to make on this piece. That's the butt cut. I want to get the blade to come in right at that short point, right on the shoulder of that miter. I'll turn it to a 90-degree angle, and I'll put the blade right on that shoulder cut. You notice I waited until the blade stopped before I removed it from the material. If I didn't wait for the blade to stop, it can grab this delicate piece and slam it into the teeth on the blade or into the guard and ruin it. And this is the piece that we want to finish that self-return. It goes right on the end, just like so, and finishes off this corner right to the wall.
Crown molding is just like baseboard, whether you're installing it on the ceiling or under a mantel shelf, as I am here. For an inside corner, on the left side of the piece I'm holding, the long point of the bevel is against the wall. For an inside corner, the long point of the miter is always at the bottom of the molding. For an outside corner, on the right side of this piece, it's exactly the opposite. The short point of the bevel is against the wall, and the short point of the miter is at the bottom of the molding. Whether you're going to cut the crown molding in position or on the flat, measurement marks are always made at the bottom of the molding. To cut in position, you have to turn the material upside down so it can be supported by the fence and the saw base. Just think of the saw base as the ceiling, and remember the right side of the molding is the left-hand corner. The great thing about cutting in position is that the crown molding is upside down with the measurement marks face up, and the saw cuts a miter and a bevel simultaneously. For an inside corner, the long point of the miter and the bevel must be against the fence. I'm just making the first cut in the piece to the left of the blade. Now you can see the inside corner cut even better on the right side of this piece, with the long point of the miter bevel toward the fence. For an outside corner, like I'm cutting in this picture, the short point of the miter and the bevel must be against the fence.
Let's review some of the basics I've been talking about. Trim carpentry is all about long points and short points. Casing is only about short points, and when you cut casing, you cut it lying flat, just the way it sits on the wall. Crown molding and baseboard are different. You cut crown molding and base in position, and an inside corner, the long point of the miter will always be against the fence. And for an outside corner, the short point of the miter will be against the fence. There are a few other things. Always use a continuous extension wing with a power miter saw. It'll provide continuous support for your material and ensure better accuracy. It also provides a place from which you can measure the material precisely, and you can use repetitive stops then, the best way to guarantee accuracy and improve efficiency. And another thing, always keep your measurement marks toward you or up where you can see them, so that as you bring the blade down into the material, you can see the blade meet the measurement mark and ensure precision with all your cuts. Finally, when you're using a power miter saw, lock your hand on the material right at the back of the fence. That way you can creep the molding toward the blade and guarantee precise cuts, and your hand will be protected from ever wandering toward the blade itself. That's the safest way to use a power miter saw.